Oh my gosh, it is so nice to see so many friendly faces in this room right now. It makes me feel so loved. Thank you so much for being here. So I heard you already kind of learned about me in like another room, which takes a lot of pressure off. But I do, want to reiterate that I do my own project called the Portland Museum of Modern Art, and it is something that I've been working on for about 5 years, and I host visual exhibitions, I host performances, and I host site-specific installations, and I work with a lot of people that I really love, and it's a really rewarding project. And I feel really lucky to be recognized by the Portland Art Museum for the work I do enough to ask me to be here today. It means a lot to me. This is where I grew up, and this was my hometown museum, so my relationship runs deep within these halls. So we'll talk a little bit about who you guys are. So there are some members of the museum. I learned a few of you are members, maybe more. There's friends and family of mine, which is really nice to see. Hi, everybody. And then there's some paid employees who are here because this is part of the work that they do. And I think it's really important to recognize that we're sharing space together for a lot of different reasons. And I really appreciate all the people who are here working to create this opportunity of engagement. And we're here because the Portland Art Museum does a series called Artist Talks, and they ask an artist to pick one piece of work to identify with, to relate to either historically or emotionally, and kind of indulge on the painting or the photo or the sculpture. Julie's here. I got to watch yours this week. It was pretty good. And I, of course, made it a little bit harder for myself. I had a hard time picking one piece of art. So the title of this talk is called The Gilded Frames of the Impressionist Room at PAM, which is where we're standing right now. This might be kind of surprising for those of you who know me, because I am not an art historian, and I do not know a lot of deep history around Impressionism. It's not my forte, but that's also kind of why I chose it. I wanted to utilize this opportunity and speak about and kind of research and learn about something that I wasn't familiar with in the museum. And I was coming here a lot. I would say I came here about 10 times for this project. I also see this as a unique opportunity for me to use this as a platform to ask questions about and ask things to you guys about stuff that I don't necessarily understand, and maybe you guys have insights or thoughts about it, or maybe we can have a discussion afterwards of thoughts that come to mind when I'm asking some of these questions. Because I really do, I feel like this is an inquiry for me, and there is a lot of the history that I don't know. So we're gonna kind of talk about a few major moments. So why we're in this room, why we're surrounded by these paintings, is because in all the times that I was coming to this museum, I knew I wanted to work with or talk about a contemporary piece of art or a modern piece of art. That's just what I research and what I know. And I honestly would walk up these stairs. You guys all just did it. You walk down this hallway, you walk up these stairs, and I would see this room and I would just keep walking. I couldn't see the art because all I could see were the frames. And what the frames symbolize to me is very specific. And this is an aesthetic talk, so I'm not able to there's a lot of historical information about why these frames are here, and we'll cover some of it, but I can only really share my own experience with them. So embarrassingly, I passed by this floor a lot. Not only did I start spending time in this room, but I actually never really made it down this hallway, which gets into mid-century work, and then kind of at the end, on the other side of the floor, we actually get into some of the most amazing modern art in the collection. So we're actually on a powerhouse floor that I immediately judged by its cover or its container, right? And it's weird because it's not that I don't care for this kind of work. I actually love Impressionism. Claude Monet is like the first thing you see when you walk up those stairs. It should be something that pulls you in. It's actually one of the prides of this collection. But I really wanted to like kind of sit back and ask myself why I was having that experience. And I think it's because my mind associates these frames with something different. It associates with classical paintings, with like portraiture, right? 18th and 19th century portraiture to be exact. There's actually a bunch in the other building right now by Rembrandt. Landscapes and history museums kind of all together. You get a lot of landscapes with these frames. I think of salon style hanging. There, you know, for many years, these kinds of paintings were hung in big galleries all together in big clusters. But honestly, what I really think at the root of it is, when I see this work, I think of colonialism, and I think about Western colonialism influence on contemporary and modern arts history. And so when I finally make it through this hallway and I come up these stairs, I don't want to see any more of that. I want to see new voices. I want to see I think it's just like a pilgrimage. It's like I compartmentalize the other building in this museum. And so I wanted to kind of exercise that. I wanted to relieve myself of that just immediate snap judgment, because we are surrounded by some pretty amazing paintings. And one to be like specific and like talk about one of the paintings is behind you guys, there's this amazing small painting in the corner there by the artist Odilon Redon. It's called The Homme et les Sphinx. He's a French symbolist painter that was born in 1840 and died in 1916. That actually was painted about six years before he died, so it was at the end of his career. And when I was spending a lot of time in this room, that painting kind of stood out to me as one of the most significant or contemporary works, like something that I could see in a contemporary art gallery or I could see in a museum. And the only thing that's identifying that it belongs in this room for me is that frame. And that's a pretty crazy frame, right? That's like half the size of the painting, you know? It doubles the size of that work. And there's like velvet trim. I mean, it's a very ornate container. And so I'll tell you a little bit about Redon, just so you can get some history about this moment in Impressionism, which I can also and should talk to you guys about. But so Redon's work was described as a synthesis of nightmares and dreams because they contained dark, fantastical figures from the artist's own imagination. So that puts him right smack dab in the middle of the post-impressionist movement. For those of you who do or don't know about art history, basically right around the turn of the century, painters started really changing their gaze. They started not just painting what they saw, but painting what they felt. And that really is what kind of pushed art into modernism. And he's a really great example of somebody who represents an exploration of an internal feeling or psyche. He himself wants to place the logic of the visible at the service of the invisible. And that really that's a perspective shift. And so to kind of go back a little bit, I should address the fact that like there are a lot of reasons that these paintings are in the modern and contemporary building, right? The main one is a lot of people believe that this work is what was like birthed modernism. It led us into the contemporary art diaspora, and so we're here now because of the vision of a lot of the paintings you see on these walls. So I'm not trying to argue against why these paintings are here. I think what I'm trying to really look at is why I'm not able to see these paintings, and I feel like I just see the frames. So something interesting that Redon says is, "My drawings inspire and are not to be defined. They place us, as does music, in the ambiguous realm of the undetermined. And it's cool that he talks about music being a part of the idea of this ambiguous realm because, I mean, this is a digression a little bit, but we've created all of these ways to experience music out in the world in all of these different places, but we still have these very structured and like pretty straightforward ways of interacting with and seeing contemporary art. We haven't been able to kind of expand our minds or let ourselves start looking at art like this in other containers. So this painting that I just talked about is kind of what got me thinking about these frames because I really wanted to talk about this painting. I'm glad I didn't though because in my research I saw another artist has already addressed it and she did a great talk about it, and I just thought it really spoke to me as something that could exist in the contemporary realm. But that in that same sentiment, I basically was just like, I can't get over this frame. And then I like looked around and I was like, I can't get over that frame, and I can't get over that frame, and I started getting angry. And then I had originally imagined that I was going to talk about the WPA and give you guys this really interesting history lesson in the WPA movement because I have a show up at my space about that work. But this kind of kept coming back to me. So I will give you some information about these frames now that I've complained about them enough. So without going too much into the deep history of them, because I am kind of more interested in kind of thinking critically about the limits or status that these frames imply, I do want to like kind of at least, give credit to the era that they come from, which is the Baroque era. And I learned a lot by researching one exhibit called that was at the Getty in 2015, called A French History of Gold, Gilded, and Fancy Frames. And that explored the framing styles from 1610 to 1792. And it was cool. That exhibit was just frames. The Getty did a whole exhibit of just frames like this and the history of these frames. And in researching that, it made me then be like, okay, so what's Baroque? Like really, like let's look at what Baroque means. And I could not give you a better explanation than the dictionary, which is so hardcore when you think about colonialism. The popularity and success of the Baroque style was encouraged by the Catholic Church, which had decided at the time of the Council of Trent, in response to the Protestant Reformation, that the arts should communicate religious themes with direct and emotional involvement. The aristocracy viewed the dramatic style of Baroque art and architecture as a means of impressing visitors by projecting triumph, power, and control. So this style was popular, came from Italy, went to France, 18th and 19th century. It basically was the style for about 300 years in Europe, and at the turn of the 20th century remained to be in vogue. Basically, every single King Louis was super into this kind of framing. I could list them off, but they're all named Louis. So we're looking back as far as 1600. I'm going to take a sip of this. And that means that this heavy, dramatic, impressing, like I think about impressing and I think about like pushing into style of containing the paintings of artists that is so dramatically different. Even in those 300 years, painting changed so much. So we could spend hours talking just about how involved making a frame like this is, or the fact that they could definitely be considered works of art themselves and should be. Like, I'm not saying that they're not gorgeous in their own like design, but I do think that they are imposing. I brought an example of a crazy frame corner for you guys to see, pass it around. Like that's like one corner. So you think about like the fact that a frame like this adds at least like 15 pounds to a painting in this room, you know. Think about just like the art shipping alone for something like that. No, like this one's probably not hand carved. Some of them that are older might be, but we'll kind of get into actually the age that most of these frames come from in a second. Oh, well, I'll talk about it right now, actually. So I just want to say that the next bit of information that I have and that I'm going to share with you all comes from the curator of this room. His name's Dawson Carr. He's the Janet and Richard Geary Curator of European Art. And his main focus is on the works in the other building, and then it kind of just trickles into this room. Like, this is where it ends. So he came all the way over here to talk to me about these frames. And he was so awesome. And I thought he was going to kind of talk about things that were a little over my head or about parts of history that were intimidating to me. But he was pretty straightforward and very generous. And what I learned from him is that actually most of the frames in this room are not original to the paintings. They are dealer-inspired frames. They are from the secondary market. And for those of you who don't know what that is, the secondary market is basically when, these paintings have been bought and sold multiple times. And they're donated by somebody who has bought them from somebody else, not directly from the painter. So most likely, most of these frames were made in the last 50 years. And they are just kind of part of this like continuous cycle of buying and selling art, and they are meant to convey luxury and evoke the old masters. So that's also kind of interesting, just to think about the fact that we are progressing as visual artists at this point, like in this turn of the century way, like they're starting to push against the old ways, but the container is remaining the same. It's really hard for the people who are paying for this work to let that happen. There's actually no precedent for being historically accurate or appropriate when displaying work from this era. That's also something I learned, which is really interesting. It's relatively a new concept that they would that like museums or registrars or historians are starting to think about actually displaying art the way that the artist intended or that the period intended. That's new. That's 20 years old, basically. So I learned all of that, and I also learned that most of the artists of this time preferred their work in very simple frames, that these are not the frames that they would hope to have their work in. So much so that some of them, like the artist James Abbott McNeill Whistler, who was a really rad activist artist, he would frame his works himself and sign the back of the frame and not the painting, so that it had to stay with the painting. There's also a rumor that Degas, who's actually over there, and you can see there's just a horrible frame on the Degas over there. As my personally thinking that. He saw a painting that he made in the house of a collector in a giant ornate frame and walked up, took it off the wall, turned it around, and put it back down because he was so upset to see this kind of gaudy thing around something that was so pure to him. So this is also like kind of an interesting shift along with the perspective of painting. You start seeing artists start finally caring about how their work is represented once they make it. That's happening in the same moment of this kind of push from post-impressionism. They start thinking about the extension of the frame as a direct companion, therefore an influencer of how their work is viewed and received. And I would just say that it is interesting to think about not just the perspective shift of the painting or the work itself, but also the presentation might be a real indicator of when we do move into the modern canon. So sadly, there's little information about the frames that most of these works came in. We don't have very many images that exist. I looked up online and I saw a picture of Monet in his studio, and his pieces were all framed in really simple wooden frames. But I also my same research saw that he was fine with gold frames. He was into it. They really do serve his paintings because they're these large paintings, and you can spend some time looking at that Monet around the wall there. But in that same kind of breath, I have to say that I experienced some of Monet's paintings in Japan when I was out there last year at a museum that was designed by a minimalist named Tado Ando called the Chichu Museum. And there was a whole installation dedicated to Monet, and his works were on basically just behind glass with very simple white frames on a big white wall lit by natural light, and that by far was the most unparalleled experience I could imagine seeing Monet's work. So there is something to be said about designing the container for the work and really thinking about people's experience, the viewer's experience, once they're in front of it. So learning this information about the secondary market, imposing its standards on post-impressionist work by giving it frames that speak more to wealth and class of the owner versus the work itself really brings up a lot of questions for me, mainly regarding how we choose to display art and who gets to decide the trends of an era, if not the artists. So thinking about those things, eventually my mind does go to the museum as a container itself. And that might be because of the work I do already is about kind of institutional critique and dialogue around what a museum is. But the more I do this investigation here, the more I do think about if I have this weird adverse reaction to gold ornate frames, like what are the museums that I have that reaction to, or what are the containers of this art that I have a reaction to? How does a museum choose to frame something and why? So the role of the museum is so multifaceted, and even more so this museum, because it has to serve as a container for so many different collections, so many different areas of history and different objects of value are here, and this museum is tasked to present them all. But I thought that a good place to start in my relationship with this floor was to examine the containers and the way this work is presented. So with that in mind, and in a very humble attempt to level the playing field, I have an exercise for us. So this is going to be the public engagement section. I've asked my friend and collaborator, Matt Emmons, who's over here, to assist me for this segment. And while he gets set up, I'll go over what we're going to do. Thanks, Matt. So I want to spend some time walking around this room, really looking at these paintings without the frames. There's a lot of ways you can do this. You can use your imagination. You can use your hands. But I brought these things, and I would love it if you use them, because this could be really fun if you do. And I'll put them right here, and I'll show you what I'm thinking. So these are two, ironically, these are from a frame shop, and they are mat boards, and you can kind of create your own shape if you walk around, and that will help you stand back and block the frame and just see the painting the way the artist made it. And Matt's going to play the steel drum while we do that, and I imagine about 10 or 15 minutes of this can really help you contemplate some of the questions I'm going to give you. But I also really want you to spend time kind of moving from this room, walking down the hallway, which is when we get into this mid-century work, which the container changes completely. And it's really interesting to see how drastically and dramatically it changes in such a short period of time after 300 years of not really changing. And I do see the abstract expressionists, which is kind of where we're going to end up at the end of your exercise. You'll see how the frame almost completely disappears or becomes a very different container by the time you end up in that era. So I have these, and I have a little list of questions that I'll read to you right now, but I also printed out in case you in case because there's kind of a lot of questions, so if you want to like reflect back on them, the questions are, so what would the art in this room look like without these frames? We're going to think about that. What would this art look like if it was removed from this room without the context of the historical period that lifts it up or represents it? What other containers exist that help shape how we contextualize art? Who do you think determines the value of this art? What else in this room besides art is valuable to you? What is the ideal container for the art we care about? If this museum was a frame, what kind of frame would this museum be? And then what is the role of the museum in the 21st century? So I have these here too. Matt's gonna take it away. He's gonna play some beautiful music. And I also, if this exercise doesn't interest you, you are also welcome to go just watch him play music. It's really entertaining too. And I'll have a few closing remarks and a few more comments to make in the other room when we're done, and we can have some Q&A. And you guys, I'd love to hear your thoughts and reflections. Thank you.
I'm trying in my mind to think, when I think of the picture of Gertrude,
You're gonna try to block it out.
No. When I think of Gertrude Stein's
studio,
I don't see frames at all in my mind.
Oh, totally.
And the barns.
Oh, you got two.
Is it true the barns too? We were just there. I'm trying to think.
Oh, yeah. So I wanted to end in front of this Yiffy Kimball piece. One, because there aren't a lot of women in the other room, and this is a really radical painting by a Native American woman. And two, because the frame is basically the antithesis of all the frames that we were just looking at. You see the painting itself is actually coming out from the container, from the frame, putting the frame in the background and the painting in the foreground. It's also wooden, not painted, and feels really humble, and it feels like it's a part of the painting. I wasn't able to find out if it was the original frame, but it kind of seems like it would be. She was cool. She painted a lot of spiritual imagery and was influenced by the atomic sciences in the mid-century. So she painted a lot of burning planets, atmospheric gases, and flashing comets. Her work was also inspired by American Indian spiritual symbols, which are evident in this painting. You're also, looking at this, you're also surrounded by a lot of abstract expressionist work, notably Jackson Pollock's piece here, which in the same sense is totally presented in the foreground, and the frame itself is white and kind of more invisible. It really lets you see the art. So kind of just to wrap it up, I thought that this inquiry was important for me because I'm actually researching, I'm in the middle of like this research and development phase on a bigger project with Pam. I've partnered with them to develop a program that will start in the late fall where I explore artists' role in the museum and how we can help shape the institution that we want and to see in our own community. I've been working with Stephanie Parrish, who's here, as well as, and is an amazing contributor to our community and to the Portland Art Museum, as well as Grace Cook-Anderson, who is the new Northwest Contemporary Curator, and Sarah Krajewski, who is the Contemporary Arts Curator, on developing a program of exhibitions that expand on an artist's relationship to a museum. So I think it was good to start here at the base of this building, at the base of this floor, and kind of the base of modernism, and kind of the beginning of this expansive contemporary wing. The collections of this museum are very, very impressive. This is a deep collection, and this museum has a lot to offer us. So I am really kind of wondering why it's taken me so long to start coming here regularly, or it took this assignment to start coming here regularly, and why it's taken me so long to build a steadier relationship with my local museum. So I see this assignment that was initially set for me to pick a piece of art and talk about and reflect on as kind of this grander extension of the bigger program I'm developing. I started here thinking about the frames with you guys, but I feel like what I'm really trying to ask you and ask myself, like question to myself, is about how we are trained or expected to experience art. With that, my conclusion is that the real art piece I'm reflecting on and sharing with you is the museum itself. More specifically, how easy it is to make assumptions about the content based on the container and ways we can change or recontextualize the container to help us see the art within it. So thanks so much for spending time with me, and I would love to hear anybody's thoughts or questions coming away from getting to see all this work in a new way. Yeah, thanks.
So I'm wondering how fair it is to those frames over there that we didn't like. We see them in a space that's got all white walls and lots of light. Because
Right.
those pieces weren't hung in places that were all white walls and lots of light. So
Right.
the pieces in a darker room with a big brocade background or something, they probably needed something to break up whatever the background was.
Sure.
So that you could get to the art. And I don't think they got the same amount of big brightness. So part of what maybe makes them not work, I just saw the J. Paul Getty Museum a week ago.
Yeah.
And those rooms I felt like were darker, that had all the impressionist paintings with spots on the pieces so you could really look at the piece. But the whole room wasn't so bright and in here.
Right.
I have to say I enjoyed most of those pieces really well with my little,
Yeah.
my little frame and having them not be so bright. But I think that maybe there was a different reason why they. I mean, I know that it was wealth and it was the made it look like it was worth more money and whatever else. But maybe in the setting where they actually got hung, that was right.
Yeah, and also, and that's a good question I think to ask, to think about not just the frame, but like how the work is hung. But that's what I'm interested in too, is how we experience the work based on the setting. Going back to that idea that music, we've created all these different ways to experience music. We could listen to a Walkman, like walking in the Grand Canyon, and have like a religious experience. But we still are somehow confined by a lot of different structural restrictions on how we get to experience art and the way it's shown to us.
So I suspect that there are a lot of art reviewers out there that feel the same way you do, that I do about these frames. And so I'm just curious why it continues to be shown that way. And I know there's a lot of reasons, but what's your take on that as to why that you don't see more of the impressionist art in frames that don't detract, in my opinion, from looking at the painting?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, that's why I'm asking the questions too. I think that that's what's so jarring for me, to come into a room that's like, all right, this is the beginning of modern art, but we still have these traditional ways of experiencing that era. Like, that's traditional. That's not just here. That's every museum, right? Every museum is contextualizing impressionist and post-impressionist work in that way. They might be lighting it better, or they might be hanging it on white walls, or they might be hanging it salon style. but they're still in those frames, and they're still. Like I said, I just don't think there's a precedent. We're just now starting to think about framing work and looking at work in the containers that they were intended to be. But I'm also interested in looking at work in totally radical different containers that are not the intended. Like I talked about seeing those Monets in this minimalist room in Japan, you know, and that was insane. That was like the best way to see that work, in my opinion.
Well, don't you think that would be a way to bring in a whole new audience for that work, is to take that step of just saying, okay, let's get rid of these frames, let's do a show with a different kind of framing and see if people relate?
Yeah, I mean, I really feel like that Redon piece, like if I could see that piece without that frame, I could imagine it in any contemporary context. And I feel like it would speak to a lot of my, you know, my community. Yeah.
Well, it'd be fun to be able to just have a visual, like even if you just did a slideshow where you know, took pictures of a piece and then showed it in lots of different kinds of frames. So if
Totally.
you could imagine it that way.
Yeah.
It might be just I mean, you wouldn't have to take the whole museum apart and take all the pieces apart, but you could give people another way of seeing it.
Yeah. But maybe we should take the whole museum apart. Yeah?
You know, I don't know how you can really have a thorough discussion of the presentation, the framing, the curation of how things are presented to the public in an institution without talking about the politics behind it. And I mean, the thing that comes to my mind that really infuriates me was what happened to like the Barnes collection, and how it was completely stolen from the facility, the place where it was meant to be. And so there's a tremendous amount of politics involved with how things are presented to the public.
Well, sure. I mean, there's so much politics around how we all experience everything. There's politics around why we are the ones that get to be in this room and not everybody else. You know.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we're dealing with politics all the time, but you know, within an hour conversation, I feel like I could only really address the aesthetics, my aesthetics.
Well, you asked for feedback.
But we do have, you know, we do have an example of I should have written her name down, but the woman who donated that room is like the head of the board of the museum, and she loves the Impressionists and she loves the Post-Impressionists. So that room is dedicated, you know, it's her donation to this museum, and it is why it's over here. I also learned a really interesting fact about I learned a really interesting fact about when this wing was built. Dawson Carr told me that actually originally they put all of that work in this building because they wanted to get people to come over here. You know, like everyone was so used to this being like a European painting museum. And although it's always been at the forefront of contemporary work, it was really hard. And he said that they lost members, like they lost a lot of support because they put the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists here. But it really was to get the people who do come to this museum to venture under that hallway, get them up here and see that Monet or see that Van Gogh or see that Renoir. And then they're just hoping that then they keep going and see the rest. But interesting now for me, and this is my own experience, like I said, I just would walk past that stuff, you know? I walked right past it. Because I was done seeing work in those kinds of frames when I left that building. That's just like my own experience of it.
Well, there's a lot of history surrounding how this whole building came together. I mean, like I was here when they were putting the Hoffman Wing and the whole expansion period. I mean, like it was an interesting time.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if we don't have any more questions, I think we should all give Libby another round of applause.